What's up, everyone? It's me, Emma, the heavy metal lawyer, and it is time. We are in the top 10. The top 10. The top 10 best metal albums of 2021. This video will count down 10 through 6. Then the next video, the last video, will do 5 through 1. This has been part of my countdown of the top 50 metal albums of 2021. Make sure to check out the other videos. Make sure to like and subscribe. Let's go. At number 10, An Unexpected Reality by Gatecreeper. It's always risky for a band to have a new style featured prominently on the album. To feature two new styles and not feature the old style at all is literally doubling the risk, at least. But the old adage is that greater risk leads to greater reward, and Gatecreeper certainly seems to have presented us with a compelling case for this dynamic. An Unexpected Reality begins with 7 tracks of insect warfare style grindcore. Just mind-melting blast beats, buzzsaw guitars, and throat-ripping screams. What is so surprising about these 7 tracks is that while they're all about a minute long, thus making the grindcore section of the album a short 7 minutes long, each one of the songs is fully fleshed out. No filler, none of that bullshit you often see with micro-song grindcore where they puff it out with samples or noise or something else that doesn't really require actual songwriting. This is clearly a highly technical death metal band playing grindcore, and if you don't believe me, check out their 2019 album Deserted, which is way different. We're talking average track length of 4 minutes long as opposed to 1 minute long, but you'll notice that the songwriting is actually very similar. This is what I have always loved about the best death grind bands like Napalm Death and Carcass, the ability to condense the technical fury of death metal into appetizingly short songs or short parts of songs. Sometimes this preference of mine makes me feel a bit out of sync with the current trend of modern metal. Death doom has really loomed over all other extreme metal this year and for a certain amount of last year. And it's the polar opposite of death grind on the death metal spectrum. Rather than being condensed, it's instead stretched out into epic, cavernous dirges. But Gatecreeper helped me realize with this album that there isn't actually that much of a difference between death grind and death doom, because they end in Unexpected Reality with the track Emptiness, an 11-minute death doom masterpiece that has the feeling of an operatic overture, patiently wandering through the themes that were shot through in the 7-minute blur of grindcore that began the album. At 18 minutes in length, the album leaves you wanting more, but you also don't feel shorted in any way. An Unexpected Reality was definitely unexpected in a modern death metal scene where bands generally pick a side between grindcore and doom, with few having the ambition or chops to do both in the same album. But I hope after this more bands will try, because the result is truly awesome. And at number 9, we have Mirrors by Pupil. I hate the use of the term mathcore as a genre, just like I hate technical death metal being used as a genre. And I think Pupil are a great example of why I take issue with it. They are certainly a band with the mathy song structures associated with most well-known bands of mathcore like Dillinger Escape Plan. We're talking about, abandonment of the verse chorus pop song structure. We're talking about unusual time signatures. We're talking about rapid turning on a dime tempo changes. But while Pupil do not fall comfortably into any one extreme metal subgenre, I would not say that they sound like the Dillinger Escape Plan or Converge, another go-to reference for the mathcore genre. Pupil Slicer bring unorthodox rhythms, tempo changes, and song structures to death metal, grindcore, and hardcore with their music. But for me, at least, the music is far more defined by its ferocity and dark tones than the technical prowess of the band. It is, I think, at the end of the day, mostly a grindcore album, though by no means a one-dimensional one. There are parts in this album where you literally, it's just like wailing over these like clean guitars, and it sounds like a soundtrack to a horror movie. It's a fascinating album. It's got 100 dimensions to it. Go check it out. And at number 8, Horrific Compositions of Decomposition by Last Days of Humanity. It is no secret that I love gore grind. It is a bit of an odd bedfellow situation. Me, a feminist hardliner, squeamish around actual gore, something I learned when I shared office space with a personal injury firm, versus a genre known for being disgusting and offensive, usually at the expense of women. And it is true that I tend to lean towards the gore grind that's more about an existential reckoning with our bodies as gross combinations of flesh, fluids, and mucus rather than the I'm gonna chainsaw a woman and describe what happens gore grind. Stuff like Carcass and County Medical Examiners is what really hits the spot for me. And few bands do that kind of gore grind as well as Last Days of Humanity. It's not surprising, the band is one of the gore grind originals, starting in 1989, though not putting out a full-length album until 1998 with their debut classic, The Sound of Rancid Juices Sloshing Around Your Coffin. Just coming up with titles like that is really just amazing. It's just so disturbing. The band appeared to peak in 2006 with their album Putrefaction in Progress, where the band drew from their experience doing a split with other well-known gore grind band Lymphatic Phlegm in 2004 to tighten their style of relentlessly pounding micro-song madness. Most of the tracks by Last Days of Humanity are barely over 10 seconds long, let alone 30 seconds or a minute long. The band split up briefly, occasionally getting back together to play the big music festivals, and then this year, seemingly out of nowhere, at least for me, they released Horrific Compositions of Decomposition, and it is truly their new opus. The whole album sounds like if you took Putrefaction in Progress to some dark alternative dimension where everything was heavier, sludgier, and more gruesome. While some grindcore bands have abandoned using samples in their intros and outros, like Magruder Grind for example, Last Days of Humanity have perfected the art form, using the samples along with the song titles and lyrics to consistently permeate the album with its central theme, the connection between mental illness and the grotesque nature of the body. And in that theme is something that transcends a crude, morbid fascination with gore and becomes something much scarier. Sure, there are campy horror movie quotes thrown in too, the most fun of which is from the highly underrated Evil Dead remake, where the possessed girl says, "I'll rip your soul out, Daddy!" But the real horror in the album starts at the track Examination of Reeking, Putrefying Organs, Tissues, Body Fluids, and continues with the following track, Principles of Pathology. And the sample is from a conversation between a psychiatrist and the calm, soft testimony of someone who, despite not saying anything we would associate with psychopathy or violence, seems very foreboding. Particularly, it is the evasiveness and vagueness of it that you get the impression that the patient is avoiding speaking some horrific truth about themselves. I actually found the video on YouTube, the video that the sample is from, and it's a real psychiatric interview. And watching it, you get the sense more in context that the patient is like gay or transgender or some other kind of benign difference. And it's a great example of how art can remix something contextually and completely change it, even when using the same exact recording. Because I would have never have guessed. I would have thought it was, I originally did think it was from a horror movie rather than being an actual psychiatric interview. And it prompts the listener to think, is this me? That feeling of isolation and loneliness, of difference and fear of being others. All humans feel that to some degree, and we have all especially felt it in the last 2 years. At number 7, we have Torn Arteries by Carcass. This was a great year for metal album covers, but as a vegetarian, I have to give the Best Album Cover of the Year award to The Vegetable Worship. Anyways, I love Carcass, seminal UK death grind band, gore grind godfathers who reinvented themselves into something more melodic and bluesy, starting in the 1990s and continuing to the present. While I like pretty much every album they have put out, including the album before this one, Surgical Steel, I was always more of a fan of their earlier work. That's why I was so excited when this album was teased with the track Kelly's Meat Emporium, which had the speed, blast beats, and ferocity of their earlier work in a way that we really hadn't heard from since their album Heartwork in 1993. While the album wound up as a whole still embracing their modern sound, this track was some appropriate fan service, and putting it towards the end of the album was a smart way to re-energize the listener to get to the close. But yes, modern Carcass is death rock and roll. The growling vocals and heavily distorted tonality of death metal laid over the song structures and bluesy solos, courtesy of Bill Steer, of rock and roll. Probably the best example of this merger in the album is the closing track, The Scythe's Remorseless Swing, which begins with some groovy blues hard rock riffing, but then transforms into the death metal with grindcore flavor we all know and love. As the song progresses, the two styles get closer together, merging in song, if not completely merging with each other. The track Dance of Ixtab has an utterly infectious rhythm, courtesy of the band's still fairly new drummer Dan Wilding, who is a veteran of bands like Aborted, so you know he has the chops to keep up with the highly technical playing on this album. Personally, I prefer this album to Surgical Steel, mostly because the band seems much more willing to play around with their genre ambiguity, having tracks like the title track Torn Arteries and Eleanor Rigor Mortis that lean more towards death metal, but also tracks like The Devil Rides Out that lean more towards rock and roll. Unlike the death rock and roll of a band like Entombed, where the rock and roll serves a mostly rhythmic purpose, Carcass's rock and roll is a playground for Bill Steer, who is undeniably one of the best guitar soloists of our time, and you can tell he had a lot of fun on this album. While it feels like we might be near the end of Carcass's career, just on the basis of the band having, albeit with some interruption, been around for close to 40 years, you would not know it listening to this album. Carcass are veterans, but they are not tired or played out in any way, and I have a feeling that there are still a few more great albums to be had, hopefully with a new direction expanding upon and not just repeating what they have accomplished with Surgical Steel and with this album. And at number 6, we have Cursed by Paranoid. I love D-Beat. D-Beat is a subgenre of hardcore punk with the spiritual godfather of Discharge, but was really founded as a distinct subgenre by the band Disclose. It is, of course, driven by its namesake, the D beat, which has influenced a number of other punk and metal subgenres from thrash metal to pop punk. But no one is more committed to D beat, more committed to the energy it produces, than bands in the subgenre. And no D beat band today carries that flag better than Paranoid, a Swedish D beat band that has been playing for almost a decade now. The band's Destroy Future Less System EP in 2014 got them early recognition in the crust punk circles that D-Beat is popular in, but they burst out beyond that insular group with their album last year, Out Raising Hell, which was one of my favorite albums in 2020. So I really wasn't expecting them to come out with another album this year, let alone another great album, but here we are. Cursed does for D-Beat what melodic death metal does for death metal, as I broke down in my introduction to the death metal subgenres, using polyphonic harmonization to create melody out of something that is otherwise pretty dissonant and noisy. The result has a distinct classic heavy metal feel to it, which the band embraces in instrumental passages like the album's first track, which sounds like it could have been from a Dio album. But again, Paranoid is committed to the D-Beat, and this album is a bucking bronco that once it gets started galloping, you're not going to be getting off. And just like their spiritual father, Discharge, or even a band like the Ramones, Paranoid has an uncanny ability to come up with catchy melodies made up of simple bar chords. Check out the track Shogun for exactly what I mean in that regard. Every track on this album is a instant D-Beat classic. It'll have you pumping your fists the whole album. And that does it for 10 through 6 of my best metal albums of 2021. Make sure to like and subscribe and support the bands and watch the other videos. And the next video is going to be the top 5. So make sure to check that one out.